The food of the gods, I call it, this substance that Mr. Bensington and Professor Redwood made between them. And having regard now to what it has already done, and all that it is certainly going to do, there is surely no exaggeration in the name. And so I shall continue to call it throughout my story. Scientists they were, Mr. Bensington and Professor Redwood. Distinguished scientists, eminent scientists, well-known scientists is the very least we can call them. Mr. Bensington and Professor Redwood, however, never quite merited any of these terms before they came upon their marvelous discovery. Mr. Bensington won his spurs by his splendid researches upon the more toxic alkalies, and Professor Redwood rose to eminence from a voluminous work on reaction times. The idea was Bensington's, but as it was suggested to him by one of Professor Redwood's contributions to the philosophical transactions, he very promptly consulted that gentleman. Redwood had been measuring growing things of all sorts: kittens, puppies, sunflowers, mushrooms, bean plants, and, until his wife put a stop to it, his baby. He showed that growth went out not at a regular pace, but with bursts and intermissions. And that so far as he could make out, nothing could grow regularly and steadily. It was as if every living thing grew with vigor only for a time, and then had to wait for a space before it could go on growing again. Redwood suggested that the process of growth probably demanded on the presence of a considerable quantity of some necessary substance in the blood that was only formed very slowly, and that when this substance was used up by growth, it was only very slowly replaced. And that meanwhile, the organism had to mark time. He compared this unknown substance to oil in machinery. A growing animal was rather like an engine, he suggested, that can move a certain distance and then must be oiled before it can run again. But why shouldn't one oil the engine from without? Said Mr. Bensington. The growing phase differed in the proportion of certain elements from the blood and sap from the days that were not particularly growing. Redwood suggested that the difference might probably be eliminated by the presence of a substance he had recently been trying to isolate in his researches. Mr. Bensington proposed originally to dry the stuff so soon as he was really able to prepare it upon tadpoles. And it was agreed that he should conduct the experiments and not Redwood, because Redwood's laboratory was occupied with the ballistic apparatus and animals necessary for investigation that was yielding curves of an abnormal and very perplexing sort. For some days he meditated upon the possibility of boarding out his tadpoles with some trustworthy person. And then the chance slight of the phrase in a newspaper turned his thoughts to an experimental thought. And chicks, directly he thought of it as a poultry farm. He was suddenly taken with a vision of wildly growing chicks. He conceived a picture of coops and runs, outsize and still more outsized coops, and runs progressively larger. Chicks are so accessible, so easily fed and observed, and so much drier to handle and measure, that for his purposes, tadpoles seem to him now, in comparison with them, quite wild and uncontrollable beasts. He was quite puzzled to understand why he had not thought of chicks instead of tadpoles from the beginning, and when he suggested this to Redwood quite agreed with him. Redwood said that in working so much upon needlessly small animals, he was convinced experimental physiologists made a great mistake. It is exactly like making experiments in chemistry with an insufficient quantity of materials. Errors of observation and manipulation become disproportionately large. It was of extreme importance, just at present, that scientific men should assert their right to have their material big. He found the place he seemed in need of at Hickory Brow, near Earshot, Kent. It was a queer, isolated place, in a dell surrounded by old pine leaves that were black and forbidding. A humped shoulder of down cut it off from the sunset. The little house was creeping. Several windows were broken and the cart shed had a black shadow at midday.
It was 1.5 miles from the end house of the village, and its loneliness was very doubtfully relieved by an ambiguous family of echoes. He advertised in several daily papers for a responsible couple, married, punctual, active, and used to poultry, to take entire charge of an experimental farm, 3 acres. The eligible couple, who were destined under Mr. Bensington to be the first on earth to administer the food of the gods, were not only very perceptibly aged, but also extremely dirty. They were named Skinner, Mr. and Mrs. Skinner, and Mr. Bensington interviewed them in a small room with hermetically sealed windows and a spotted, overmounted looking glass.
Mrs. Skinner was a very little old woman, capless, with dirty white hair drawn back very, very tightly from a face that had begun by being chiefly, and was now, through the loss of teeth, chin, and the wrinkling up of everything else, ended by being almost exclusively nose. She was dressed in slate color, so far as her dress had any color, slashed in one place with red flannel. She talked to him guardedly and peered at him round and over her nose. She told Mr. Bensington that she had managed fowls for years and knew all about incubators. In fact, they themselves had run a poultry farm. Mr. Skinner was a large-faced man with a lisp and a squint that made him look over the top of your head. Mr. Bensington said that they could go to the farm at once, and in a week Mr. and Mrs. Skinner were installed on the farm, and the jobbing carpenter from Hickory Brow was diversifying the task of erecting runs and hen houses with a systematic discussion of Mr. Bensington. Seemed a long time to Mr. Bensington before his first dream of enormous possibilities was replaced by a crumb realization. But at last, success dawned, and its herald was a letter in the long, slender handwriting of Mr. Skinner. "The new brood are out," wrote Mr. Skinner, "and I don't quite like the look of them. Growing very rank, growing like thistles I never saw. They peck so hard, striking above boot top, that I am unable to give exact measures as requested. They are regular giants, and eating as such. We shall want more food very soon, for you never saw chicks eat so, bigger than bantams. Going on at this rate, they ought to be a bird for show."
The next morning, Bensington alighted at Earthshot Station, and in the bag in his hand he carried, sealed in 3 tins, a supply of the food of the gods sufficient for all of the chicks in Kent. It was a bright and beautiful morning, late in May, and he resolved to walk through Hickory Brow to his farm. It was 3.5 miles altogether through the parks and villages, and then along the green glades of Hickory Brow. The trees were all dusted with the green spangles of high spring. The hedges were full of stitchwort and campion from the woods of blue hyacinth and purple orchid. And everywhere there was a great noise of birds, thrushes, blackbirds, robins, finches, and many more. These things brought back to Mr. Bensington his early and forgotten delight in life. Before him, the promise of his discovery grew bright and joyful, and it seemed to him that indeed he must have come upon the happiest day of his life. And when the sunlit run by the sandy bank under the shadow of the pine trees, he saw the chicks that had eaten the food he had mixed for them, gigantic and gawky, bigger already than many a grown hen, and still growing. Still in their first soft yellow plumage, he knew indeed that his happiest day had come. At Mr. Skinner's urgency, he went into the runs, but after he had been pecked once or twice, he got out again and watched these monsters through the wire netting. Mr. Skinner peered close to the netting and followed their movements as though he had never seen a chick before in his life. "What'll they be when they've grown up is impossible to think," said Mr. Skinner. "Big as a horse," said Mr. Bensington. "Pretty near," said Mr. Skinner. "Several people could dine off her wing."
Mr. Bensington was indeed a happy man that day. He was in no mood to find fault with details of management. The bright day certainly brought out the accumulated slovenliness of the Skinner couple more vividly than he had ever seen it before. The fencing of many of the runs was out of order, but he seemed to consider it quite satisfactory when Mrs. Skinner explained that it was a fox or a dog or something that did it. He pointed out that the incubator had not been cleaned. "That it hasn't, sir," said Mrs. Skinner, with her arms folded, smiling coyly behind her nose. "We don't seem to have had the time to clean it, not since we've been here." He went upstairs to see some rat holes that Skinner would justify a trap. They were certainly enormous, and discovered that the room in which the food of the gods was mixed with meal and bran was in a quite disgraceful disorder. Mr. Bensington sniffed critically at this disorder, but he made no unnecessary fuss. And even when he found a wasp regaling itself in a pot half full of the food, he simply remarked idly that this substance was better sealed from the damp than exposed to the air in that manner.